Good afternoon. My name is Olivia Walker, and I am a graduate student at North Central University. I am from Atlanta, Georgia, and received my BA degree from Georgia State University. Today, we will be discussing the emergence of the new psychology. Before we start, let's discuss an overview of what the lecture will be about today. First of all, we will discuss how to analyze the information. We will discuss what lens to use when analyzing the history of psychology. In addition, we will trace the journey of psychology from experimental to physiological to the new psychology. Next, we will discuss the formal founding of psychology as a discipline. We will discuss why it was founded, who founded the discipline, and how it was founded, as well as what's necessary to be a discipline. Finally, we will discuss the role of women and minorities in psychology. First of all, we will discuss the method for analyzing the history of psychology. As the slide states, the analytical model for evaluating the history of psychology is determined by point of view. The points of view used in evaluating psychology are literally like night and day or yin and yang. They are totally opposite, but historians of psychology find them useful. Before we move on to discussing the historical point of view, we have one vocabulary word: zeitgeist. Zeitgeist is the intellectual climate in existence at a certain time, characterized by shared culture, experiences, and influences, conscious or unconscious. Now that we know what zeitgeist is, we can now move on to examining the models used for analyzing historical psychology. One theory and model of evaluation of psychological history is the naturalistic theory. The zeitgeist is the reason new intellectual discoveries are made. This is a tenet of the naturalistic model. As long as there is a society, people through their interpersonal relations will progress and create. The naturalistic model continued. The naturalistic model also states the intellectual discoveries of the zeitgeist are not the result of individual genius, but of collective progress in society. Evans, a historical psychologist, says that naturalistic models have determinants, i.e. physical. Environment may be the reason fire was discovered, so that individuals could stay warm. Or political. Long-term peace may result in the founding of democracy. So in other words, a determinant is that when there arises a need for something, and it's very pressing. Society will demand that something be created to solve the problem. So when psychology came into being, it was because there was a need for it. And finally, the naturalistic model states that discoveries can be made before their time, but unless the zeitgeist is ready for the discoveries, they will be ignored. For example, if in ancient times someone starts a fire or creates fire just to be warm and nobody's cold, the discovery may be ignored until someone says, fire can cook too. The alternative model used to evaluate psychological history is the personalistic model. The personalistic model simply states that geniuses do exist and have such an impact on the spirit of the times that they completely change society by their contributions. For an example, in the video game Sid Meier's Civilization, wherever Gandhi appears in whatever time, because of his genius, he brings peace. As we begin to study the evolution of psychology into a formal discipline, the naturalistic and personalistic models are what we will use for evaluating the history of psychology. Many people think that psychology is a discipline of the senses and the emotions and how to treat hurt feelings. The reality is the roots of modern psychology lie in the examination of anatomy and experiments that truly establish that the senses really exist and that the brain has a function in how we feel. Early experiments leading to the formal founding of psychology can largely be characterized as a discipline of questioning or experimentation. First of all, we will examine and define historical physiology. Historical physiology investigated how sensations and perceptions were processed. It studied how sense information was received by a living subject. During the early years of physiology, it is very important to remember that any experiment that created a sense reaction was a physiological experiment. Historical physiology as a discipline is naturalistic because it uses all physiological experiments to get a greater understanding of the subject matter. The earliest physiologist, Johannes Muller, created a book detailing all the experiments of the discipline within a 7-year period. Two examples of very different experiments in physiology that brought greater understanding to the field will be discussed. Another study that fell under the field of psychology was the study of a deceased person's brain who had speech problems while alive. The psychologist Paul Broca performed an autopsy on the deceased person and found lesions on a portion of the person's brain, which he labeled the speech center. This portion of the brain would forever be known as Broca's brain, and this method of research would be called the clinical method. The prior two examples show that the discipline of physiology was broad prior to the finding of psychology. By the mid-19th century, the physiologists had proven the electrical nature of the brain through physiology. They had proven what Descartes had only suspected, and that was the brain and the body interacted with each other for voluntary and involuntary functions. Through a concerted effort of group but not formalized study of various experiments, the physiologists had proven the brain-body connection, and as an aside created a method of stimulating the brain we still use today, and that is called electrical stimulation. According to Schultz, experimental psychology was driven by the German 19th century zeitgeist. Germans were the only Europeans who studied taxonomy. They almost considered almost every human endeavor as worthy of study. German universities initiated a reform movement in academia that demanded innovation, research, experimentation, and discovery, as well as they eliminated the curriculum and allowed professors to create their own curriculum. As a result, they produced numerous scholars and researchers. Germany, also because of the changing political structure, had a huge number of universities producing scholars. Since Germany placed a high premium on the acquisition of knowledge, it would be the place where the contemplation of knowledge and the inner life would be proven and become a formal science. The experiment that would make it decisive that psychology should be a science and that living things were more than beings acted on by an outer force would be an experiment by Hermann van Helmholtz that proved that there was a delay between thought and action. This suggested that living beings had control of their actions prior to performing them. This was pivotal to making psychology a discipline. The next portion of the lecture discusses how psychology became a formal discipline. It puts all the pieces together. Some of you may be aware that McDonald's started out as a sole proprietorship and was purchased by a business who made McDonald's into the successful chain it is now. This can be compared to the story of the founding of psychology. There were a lot of experiments being done by many different scientists. That was psychology. But it took a visionary person to bring the science from one hamburger stand creating great hamburgers to a titan serving 100 million people. William Wundt is known as the father of psychology and did this. William Wundt was the founder of psychology because he formalized a methodology for research in psychology and defined the discipline of psychology. William Wundt called it a formal discipline and advocated for it. He also founded the first psychology lab and founded the first journal. This is how psychology became a formal discipline. Someone took the time to say, hey, this is a discipline. This is worthy of its own scientific discipline. And did it. Next, we will discuss minorities and women in early psychology. It was not until the 1920s in the U.S. that a non-white person would become a researcher in the field of psychology. According to Schultz, psychology has presented barriers to European women, but of all the scientific disciplines, has been the most embracive of European women. Discrimination towards women did exist, but psychology admitted more women to its ranks than any other discipline. By 1906, 12% of psychologists listed in American Men of Science were women. Titchener and his attitude towards women was a big joke. Titchener was a researcher. He had one meeting that women were not admitted to, but seemed to attend occasionally by maybe hiding under the table or just sitting at the door and listening. Despite this bias against women at one meeting, Titchener worked hard to admit women to his PhD program and published their journal articles. He was an advocate for women.